Okay, in this video, I want to go through topic 4.6, describe the evolution of the tasks of the government and its consequences on the government budget. You'll see it's going to be very quick because we've already said most of it when we talked about fiscal policy. There is just a few historical things that I need to add, but essentially you're good with this. Initially, let's just call that the pre-industrial era, which is basically before 1800. But essentially, in most, if not all, economies before the 19th century, we essentially had like a laissez-faire. That's how we call it even in English. Laissez-faire type of economy where the government did not intervene in the economy. So we basically had market economies with very little government intervention. Laissez-faire, laissez-passer. This was still based on the ideas of Adam Smith. Well, of course, he came a bit late, but essentially this was just this type of philosophy where just let the markets allocate resources and everything is going to be for the best because there is the invisible hand that is going to ensure that those self-interested actions will eventually benefit everyone. For example, that's the quote from Adam Smith. I forgot the quote, but it's something like, I'll read it for you because if you can remember it, that'd be amazing. Give me a second so I can find it. It starts, it is not the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer or the baker that you have your bread, beer. I forgot the quote. Okay. It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. That's a quote from Adam Smith from The Wealth of Nations. And that's essentially the description of the invisible hand of the market that just say, well, people are selfish. Yeah, okay. But what they do is good for themselves, but it's also good for everybody else, right? If I decide to open a bakery, that's not because I care about people who want bread. It's just because I know that they want to buy it, and so I can make money, right? But it's good for me, but it's also good for them. So that's essentially it means that very liberal economies function very well. That's at least what was thought back then in this era, like pre-industrial era. And that's why most thinkers back then, they were very strongly opposed to any form of government intervention. And that's the laissez-faire, laissez-passer school of thought, basically very liberal market economy. Remember that this does not mean that the government was not doing anything. Okay, there is still a government, but the government does not actively intervene in the economy, or at least the government intervention is minimal. Of course, we still have to complete what we call the sovereign function. In French, les fonctions régaliennes, which are basically police, public order, same thing, national defense, justice. That's about it. Property rights, which has to do with justice, law. That's basically the framework, right? We need that framework. Otherwise, if there is no property rights, nobody will want to produce anything because everybody can steal from anyone, right? So the same thing, we need like a legal system, we need justice. So to make sure that, oh, if something is yours, it's yours. Nobody will be able to take it from you. Otherwise, there would not be any kind of production going on. National defense, same thing. If there is no national defense, we'll just be attacked tomorrow. And so in that case, we don't have an incentive to produce anything because it can simply be taken by somebody else. Same thing, police, public order. Well, that's the same thing. That we need like a basic framework to make sure we have an environment that is conducive to business. So that's basically the minimum requirements. And that's what the government spent money on. Okay, so most of the government finances were spent on national defense, especially during periods of wars, which were quite common, of course, back then, like the internal safety, the legal system. So government expenditure were relatively small compared to the size of the economy, perhaps unless perhaps during times of wars, where of course we had to spend a lot on national defense. But you see, most interestingly, is that there were government spending was very targeted. There were just very few areas. You could add additionally like a sovereign function, but in addition, you could have like maintaining infrastructure. So yeah, you still had roads, for example, you still had like harbors, and it was also in most cases the responsibility of the government to just maintain those infrastructure, make sure they can operate. So that's also an additional cost for the government. But you see very limited intervention. In terms of revenue, because of course, well, okay, even though we don't spend much, we need to collect some money. You had, let's say, three, well, depended on countries, of course, but like in most countries, the main source of income was in fact tariffs, because of course, free trade didn't really exist back then, well, between countries. So there were customs and there were tariffs, there were protectionism going on. And this used to be the main source of income for many governments. You also had some land taxes in many countries, like for landowners who had to pay like tax to the government. And in certain countries, like the UK, you had poll taxes, which is like a flat rate for everyone. Everybody pays the same. Doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter how rich you are. There is like a flat rate for everyone. So there were some taxes, but you see nothing like income tax, VAT, corporation tax, business rate. Like all of these taxes we have now, they did not exist back then. So mostly taxes on imports, taxes on land, so property, kind of property tax, and just poll tax, which is like some kind of an individual tax, right? Everybody pays the same tax, which of course tends to be unfair, but that was not the main priority back then. So that's like the pre-industrial government, or at least the intervention in the economy. Then gradually, it took, of course, over a century, and I'm not going to enter into the details of like every single step of that movement, but basically we have gradually transitioned from this type of pre-industrial government that has minimal intervention in the government towards, let's say, the typical government that we have today in developed countries, of course not everywhere, but in most developed countries, which we call a welfare state. A welfare state. En français, État-providence. So basically what happened? So we had in the 19th century, we had the Industrial Revolution, the first Industrial Revolution. So the economy, especially in Europe, went through very significant changes. It became much more complicated. A lot of tensions appeared between the capital owners and the workers. And so the government had to pass more regulations, especially regarding labor, to start to regulate task of the government, like to regulate the economy. So again, something that was introduced gradually. Okay, initially at first we didn't have many regulations, but gradually we had more and more regulate the economy. And then eventually there was the idea that emerged that we should also protect, the government should also be there to protect those the most vulnerable. So that's at that time that we had like benefits, social security, pensions, like unemployment or disability, sickness benefits. It is at that time that the government was not only just there to ensure that there was a basic framework in which the economy could work, but you see that we gradually, the economy became like a mixed economy because the government really had its say. The government was also there, and just then we also had public education and healthcare, which was introduced and made available to everyone, especially education. The government started like to implement like a real infrastructure development strategy where we don't simply maintain what already exists. We also think about the development of infrastructure. Obviously, this like beyond like the protection of the most vulnerable, it's related, but there's also the income redistribution. We'll talk about that when we look at, which was another task of the government. Like in most countries, there is the idea that yes, because inequalities are not something that tends to be inequalities tend to cause social unrest, can create some instability, and so governments, they usually try to reduce the extent of inequalities. So of course something else is really active policies to manage the economy. Course, I am thinking about fiscal policy, monetary policy, where again, the government is a key player, is really there to intervene in the economy, to set some economic objectives, low inflation. So this is where we get closer to fiscal policy, low inflation, economic growth, low unemployment. So, and the government is also there to take actions to implement policies to get the economy as close as is this or to satisfy or to meet as many as these objectives as possible. Also, there was the idea that, hey, maybe Smith was wrong. Maybe the invisible hand does not always work because we have market powers, because we have externalities, because we have information failure, because we have public goods. And so, well, they are market failures. So, well, one function of the government is to correct market failure. So of course, all of this was very gradual. Okay, like the correction of market failure is not something that appeared at first. Initially, we had some basic regulation for mostly the labor market. Then we had public education, like income redistribution came much later. Okay, but the only thing that you really have to understand is that we gradually transitions from this pre-industrial government that did not intervene much into the economy towards this welfare state that has a much more significant role in the economy. Am I forgetting anything? Regulate the economy. So yes, regulations, protect the most vulnerable, public education, healthcare, infrastructure development, distribution, active policy, correct market failure. That's about it. So these are the most the main function of most modern governments. Of course, something that you have to recognize is that even though most governments pursue these objectives, so these are the main tasks that governments pursue, it is also important to acknowledge that they can do that to a very different extent. Okay, there are countries that are more liberal. Remember, you can mention the index of economic freedom, Singapore number 1, Switzerland number 2. Okay, where even though we can argue that the government pursues all of these tasks, the size of the government in the economy, the size of the public sector, or the influence of the government into the economy is relatively small. And there are other countries where with much less economic freedom, where those tasks or the means that the government is using to achieve these targets will account for a much greater part of GDP, or will have a much bigger influence on the economy. Okay, so these are the main tasks. Now, in terms of government spending and taxes, it's a bit repetitive because we've already talked about that when we looked at fiscal policy. So I'm just going to go through that very quickly. Just take that as a review. Okay. So in terms of government revenue, so what we have now, so of course we mostly have taxes. We have direct taxes like income, corporation tax, inheritance tax, capital gains, indirect taxes, like VAT, for example, like excise duties. Excise duties are taxes on specific products like gasoline, like alcohol, tobacco. Tariffs, but interestingly enough, now in most countries, especially because now we have like free trade areas and we have eliminated most tariffs. But so in the past, in pre-industrial era, it used to be the main source of income for many governments. Now it's less than 1% in most developed countries. And you also have like revenue from public companies. Okay, public companies, they sometimes do sell public services and they receive income. So it can be regarded as a form of government revenue. And remember, you have the sovereign wealth funds, which is basically when governments, they own assets like bonds of other governments or any other financial or physical assets that can generate income. Okay, so I say, for example, if the Chinese government owns US government bonds, every year the Chinese government is going to receive interest payments on the bonds. So these are the main sources of government revenue. Again, nothing new. Yeah, nothing new. Just a reminder of what we've done previously when we talked about fiscal policy. And in terms of government spending, so the main areas of government spending, number one, because in welfare states in many countries, number one is social protection. So that mostly includes benefits. Okay, when we say social protection, protecting those who are the most vulnerable. So pensions, sickness benefits, child benefits, disability benefits, unemployment benefits, all those benefits to support those who are the most in need. Then you have healthcare, public healthcare, of course, public hospitals and education. Remember, we sometimes call them merit goods. These are goods that are not sufficiently produced by the market. It's a cause of market failure. So we want to encourage the production and consumption of these goods because they are often considered to be essential. So we want everybody to be able to access basic healthcare and basic education regardless of their financial situation. Then you have public goods. So like, for example, national defense. We also have like public order and safety. So that's essentially, these are still the sovereign functions. We still have them, of course. Public order, and you could say, yeah, law, justice. They are still there, okay, the sovereign functions. And all that, like national defense, public order, dual justice, it's like less than 10%, okay? In most countries, less than 10%, whereas it was 200 years ago, or 250 years ago, it was 100%, basically. Of course, you still have the infrastructure, like the maintaining and developing infrastructure. Communication, transportation, airports, roads, like internet, anything. The pipes, gas, the water, sewer system, like all that. Okay, infrastructure. Of course, you have subsidies to businesses, okay, to particular industry to support them. Like for example, the primary sector, farmers, could be transportation, like all those subsidy or research and development, anything that is there to support any particular effort. And maybe the last one, because I think that's enough, is going to be what we call debt servicing. When we borrow money, every year we have to pay back some interest payments. I'm not even talking about paying back like the initial amount that we borrowed. We call it the principal. But every year we have to pay some interests on the amount that we have not yet paid back. Okay, so paying those interests, that's what we call debt servicing. So this is essentially, these are the main areas of government spending. So of course we see that over the last 250 years, government spending has become increased very significantly because there are more areas of intervention than before. But at the same time, new sources of income for the government have been developed with income tax, corporation tax, inheritance tax. These are things that didn't really exist before. So of course, in order to be able to finance additional expenditure, there was the need to levy more taxes to get more sources of income. Of course, we can always borrow, okay, whenever we have a budget deficit. And remember to talk about this term, budget surplus, budget deficit. But it's not sustainable in the long run to have a persistent budget deficit. Otherwise, we keep borrowing, our public debt grows bigger and bigger. It creates a snowball effect where the burden of the public debt becomes too heavy and we end up defaulting, not being able to pay back. So that's why, as the role of the government became increasingly important in our economies, the amount of revenue that was levied also had to keep up, just to make sure that the debt was sustainable. Of course, these are just rough. This is a rough representation. The actual composition of government revenue, government spending varies from one country to the other. It depends on the level of economic development. It depends on the economic system within that country. But I would say that this is a good average of what has happened in most developed countries, especially in European countries. All right, that's about it.